Hi, I'm Arnie Skelton, and each week in this podcast series I'm going to offer you my top 10 tips on particular topics or themes that might be of interest to you as a teacher or manager or both. Hi, and welcome to this week's podcast, which is entitled Information Management. Now, this is a huge topic, and so I'm just choosing my top 10 tips. So I'll probably be leaving out a stack of stuff that not only would be worth including, but you probably would think perhaps sometimes more important than what I'm going to say. But I've tried to keep it to top tips that are practical and usable, and here we go. Here's my first. Tip number 1 is to address overload. I think I hear more than anything else a complaint that people are overloaded with information. And I'm assuming that information overload, is inevitable. It's a part of organisational and business life, and so in my view, it's a given. So what's a given is that information comes in a way that, and goes out in a way that's overloading in terms of how you deal with it. But of course, what isn't a given is how you manage it. So the overload, I think, is a bit inevitable. How you manage it isn't, and that's the key point. There are a number of ways for managing overload, and I've mentioned some of them in previous podcasts, such as using email headers more effectively and using a code to indicate the degree of importance of the text and or its urgency. So all I'm going to say on this tip is know what you need to know as a priority and ensure those who feed you that information create an appropriate heading when sending you the material, particularly by email. So know what you need to know as a priority and ensure those who feed you that information create an appropriate heading when sending you the material. So you don't have to search the email, you just have to search the headings. Tip number 2, it's not what you know, but how to find it. So the bad news first. It's simply impossible to know everything and instantly. The good news is it's relatively easy to find out what you need to know. If it exists, it's findable. So don't be fooled into thinking that you need to know and need to know everything. It's no longer what you know, but how to find it, including who to ask. Keeping up to date with everything will almost certainly overload you and create stress. Also, there's a danger in thinking that what you know is accurate and correct. Yet change is happening at such a pace that it again may be more important to accept your ignorance and just check the relevant sources which are likely to be more up to date than what you think you know. Tip number 3. Inform or consult. When sending information out, decide first if your reason is to inform the reader or to consult the reader. Then keep 2 mailing lists, one under each heading, and send the information accordingly. Tip number 4. Find the proactive-reactive balance. In terms of receiving information, you need to find the balance between being proactive or reactive. If you are proactive and want to keep in touch and ahead of the game, then you will be better informed on a daily or weekly basis, but will probably pay a heavy price in terms of the time it takes you to stay up to date in so many areas. If you take a more reactive approach and wait until you need to know and then go and find out, you will spend far less time keeping up to date, but may put yourself under pressure to find things out quickly. You need to find the balance between the two. Tip number 5. 2 key questions. My dad told me this when I was 11, and it's never left me as a valuable piece of advice. He said all communication boils down to 2 questions. What do they want to know? And what do you want to tell them? Answering both or either of these questions will keep you and your message focused and have a point. Tip number 6. The difference between content and message. This, in a way, follows on from the previous point. What people want to hear are the key messages. It's not content, it's message. Because everything you say or write will, by definition, have content. But what makes it meaningful content is the messages. Are the messages clear? So from here on, make sure you focus on messages, not content. Anyone can produce content. What determines the quality of the content, whether it's gold dust or garbage, is the quality and clarity of the messages it contains. You may well have read a report which has tons of content and no clear message. Tip number 7. A good structure helps. Just one example. The Economist magazine has a deserved reputation for being well written. One of the reasons is the principles that all its writers have to follow. And one of these I really like is the use of paragraphs. One of the principles for effective writing for The Economist is that the first sentence of each paragraph should identify what the paragraph text is about, i.e. its key message, and the final sentence should have the main conclusion from that paragraph. The editors know that the magazine is read mainly by very busy people who are helped by such an approach, since they can read the first and last lines of each paragraph and get what they need simply, quickly, accurately and effectively. Tip number 8. Matching. Match how you receive, store and access information to meet your preferred learning or memory preference. This is also something I've mentioned in an earlier podcast. For example, if you're a visual person, then however the information was presented to you, create your own visual version. That is, translate it into a more user-friendly format for you. If, for example, you want to remember something, then if it's in text form, then create an audio for it and listen to that and play it back on a walk or in the car. So keep in mind that however you receive the information, it may not be in the best format for you. So think of translating or converting it into something more helpful to you. Tip number 9. Automation. There's really too much to say that's anything significant in this podcast because it's a huge topic. But you may want to assure that you are new school rather than old school in this regard. Check. Can technology carry some of the load and actually save you having to do it all yourself? Check. Are you using paper still when recording, photographing or using one of the thousands of apps could take some of the load from you? Have you considered or are you using an electronic personal assistant? Next week I'm going to offer my top 10 technology tools that can help with managing information. And my final tip this week, tip number 10, is for those of you who are teachers to consider your teacher's role. Now, this is an issue close to my heart, as some of my articles for FE News have indicated. In my view, the role of teacher as a knowledge provider is now pretty defunct. Learners can now access more information more quickly and more accurately and from a variety of sources than they can relying on a fairly static single information source which might well be out of date, i.e. you as a teacher. So I think the role of a teacher these days is that of a learning facilitator. In fact, I'd love to see a name change from one to the other. A learning facilitator encourages the learners to find things out for themselves, obviously under guidance, and then convert what would otherwise have been an often tedious lecture into an opportunity to discuss, clarify, and check what the learner has actually learned. So that's it. Let me just run through my top 10 again. Tip number 1, address overload, given that overload is a given. Tip 2, it's not what you know, but how to find it, including who to ask. Tip number 3, when sending information out, decide whether you're informing or consulting. Tip number 4, find the proactive and reactive balance between keeping in touch and up to date. Tip number 5, ask the 2 key questions. What do they want to know? What do you want to tell them? Tip number 6, distinguish between content, which is meaningless, and message, which is meaningful. Tip number 7, a good structure helps, such as that used by The Economist. Tip number 8, match how you receive, store and access information to your preferred learning or memory preference. Tip number 9, Use automation to help you manage your way through the information overload. And tip number 10 for teachers: move away from being a lecturer who's a knowledge-based giving expert to a learning facilitator whose main role is to encourage learners to access the information for themselves and then to make sure, as a facilitator, they know how to use it. So, as I've just mentioned, next week I'll be looking at my top 10 tools that really help with information management. So if that's of interest to you, please tune in again next week. But for now, thanks for listening, and bye for now. Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, make sure you subscribe. You will still get the podcast for free, but you will also get an alert to let you know when the next podcast is available. And please recommend the podcast to anyone else you think might like it and benefit from it. Also, I'd really appreciate it if you could leave a review and any other comment, because they'll help promote the podcast series on the relevant platform. So, bye for now.